it is a huge source of mineral nutrients. Boy, so that residue or stover is not litter or trash. There is a huge value of it. Now, I know the question is, well, you know, how much stover do I get? Well, it depends on the yield. All right, using a harvest index of 52%, I can calculate for various yield levels how much stover remains. And I've done that here. These are tons, US tons, not metric tons. So there's a lot of stover. So 200 bushels per acre, 4.5 pounds stover. That's above ground. By the way, there's almost no stover below ground. I'm going to talk about roots here in a minute, but there's almost none. The ratio of above ground to below ground, 25 to 1. I mean, roots may exude carbon, but they do not store it underground. There's almost none that's left at the end of the season. So most of the stover is above ground. Now notice, as you increase your yield, guess what? You increase the stover, or the residue. That's food for microorganisms, but it is also a huge source of potential nutrients. Okay, we've measured the stover. I actually published this a couple years ago. So I can tell you exactly the nutrient content of a ton of stover. I mean, this is physically measured, right? So for every ton of stover, 20 pounds of N, 4 pounds of P2O5, 23 pounds of potassium in every ton. So if I take this and I multiply it by the amount of stover that I know comes from different yield levels, I can calculate the value of nutrients in different yield levels. And I've done that here. Here's where I disagree with what was presented early. I think in one of the things you guys showed me the numbers for 200 bushel corn. Mine are completely different. You showed me 200 bushel corn. I think you had 64 N. Odd that you would, show me less than there actually is in there. You had 21 P. It's close. You had 120 K. It's close. I mean, this is what I publish on the amount that's in stover. Now notice, of course, as you increase the yield, if I have 300 bushel corn, there's a lot of nutrition which is in that stover. I want to capture that nutrition. So I want to come back to this, and I'll go back to the pounds in each ton. And I'm going to tell you something. Larry alluded to this out on the tour today, kind of stole the little my thunder. But one thing I will tell you is that if you have a cation in stover, potassium's a cation, this would be true of calcium or magnesium or zinc or any cation. So I did the math here for potassium. And I said, okay, what's 3 times 23 pounds per ton? And it's 69. 69 pounds for the value of potassium per ton. How am I going to get the full nutritional value of my stover? I know you haven't talked about it much here, but the first thing you're going to have to do is you're going to have to chop it into smaller pieces. I mean, that's a no-brainer, right? We all have, well, not all of us, but you have chopping heads that go on combines now. I mean, I have 2 combine heads. One of them is, so chopping it into smaller pieces. I'm going to cut it up, right? I chew my food. I'm going to chop it into smaller pieces. And one of my combine heads has column or BT choppers on it. A standard John Deere stalk roller does not size the stover, just pulls it through. So there's the difference between a standard John Deere stalk roller and a Calmer BT chopper. It's in smaller pieces. All right. In my research, when I have continuous corn that has a lot of stover, or I have high yield or no-till, which has a lot of stover, this practice is worth 10 bushels, just simply by chopping it. All right. What's the other thing you can do? Well, you can treat it with a biological like excavator. I mean, we've heard a lot about this. Now, I have to tell you, I've never worked with excavator. I have worked with competing products to excavator. And in my hands, treating it with a biological, that's another 5 bushels. So 10 if I chop it, 5 if I treat it. And if I do both, it's 18 bushels. So it's more than adding them together. I mean, this has got to be the future of high yield, right? You're going to have to manage that residue. And one thing is going to be with a biological. So I'm here to tell you that yield is not just the weight of the grain, it's also the amount of residue that's produced. What is the corn yield gap? So the corn yield gap. So the corn yield gap is the difference between the record yield and the average yield. And there's a huge corn yield gap. Every one of you has a record yield. I don't know what it is, but you know, it's whatever record you produce. There's the average yield. And then that gap is the opportunity to increase yield with better crop management. So you know the National Corn Growers have a contest every year. And the highest yield ever produced in the U.S. National Corn Growers Contest, 2019, 616.1953 bushels. Mr. Hula. That contest is so important, it carried out to 10,000 of a bushel. Dave, I'm going to say that's damn close to 616, okay? And we'll go with that. I will tell you that you have the pleasure of hearing Mr. Hula tomorrow, and he has done something that nobody else has done. And that is, he has broken the negative relationship among yield components. Has to have done it. There's no other way to produce 616 bushels. He's broken that negative relationship. So, I mean, well done. That's the key. He's done that. Had to have multiple ears, tillers or something. I don't know how it happened. You know, hurdles the size of my thumb. But he also has a lot of residue to manage. I mean, you must have a foot residue, man. I mean, I looked at, I did the calculation, 616 bushels with a harvest index of 52. You have almost 14 tons of residue that has to be managed. And I calculated the nutrition that's in your residue from your world record yield, and if I could just get my hands on your residue, I wouldn't have to fertilize. That's where I think that's where products like excavator are so important, when you have that much residue. So more yield means more crop residue. Crop residue is yield. I never forget about it. It's not trash, it's not litter, it's just your carbon sequestration. I don't care what you want to call it, but it is valuable as long as you match it.